A human baby is, by any reasonable measure, a disaster waiting to happen. It can't hold up its own head. It can't regulate its own body temperature. It can't walk, can't feed itself, can't even tell you what's wrong beyond screaming and hoping for the best. Compared to a baby zebra, which can outrun a lion within an hour of being born, a human infant is almost embarrassingly helpless. So here's the question worth sitting with. How did any of us survive infancy for the roughly 300,000 years before there were cribs, formula, pediatricians, or car seats? The short answer is that ancient parents weren't doing it alone. The long answer is a lot stranger and a lot more interesting. The fourth trimester anthropologists have a term for the first few months of a human baby's life: the fourth trimester. The idea is that human babies are essentially born too early compared to other primates, because our skulls have to squeeze through a narrow pelvis built for walking upright. If we gestated as long as our brain development would otherwise require, birth would be nearly impossible. So evolution made a trade. Babies come out early, underdeveloped, and finish a huge chunk of their brain growth on the outside. That trade meant an early human infant needed almost constant contact just to survive the first year. Not occasional attention, constant. Studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups like the Hadza in Tanzania or the Kung San in the Kalahari give researchers a rough window into what that constant contact actually looked like before agriculture reshaped how humans lived. In these groups, infants are held or carried for the vast majority of daylight hours in their first year, sometimes upward of 90% of the time. Not swaddled and set down, held. That's not gentle parenting culture. That's survival math. A baby left on the ground in the open savanna is a baby exposed to predators, cold nights, biting insects, and terrain that could injure it in seconds. The village was not a metaphor. Here's something that gets lost when we picture ancient parenting. It was almost never a two-person job. Modern households tend to run on one or two exhausted adults handling an infant largely alone. That setup is, historically speaking, an anomaly. Anthropologists use the term alloparenting to describe caregiving provided by someone other than the biological parents, grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, even unrelated members of the group. In many hunter-gatherer societies, infants are passed between multiple caregivers throughout the day, sometimes nursed by women other than their own mother. A mother who needed to forage, process food, or simply sleep wasn't expected to solve that problem by herself. The group solved it for her. This wasn't charity, it was infrastructure. A group that didn't distribute child care lost mothers to exhaustion, lost infants to neglect born of sheer human limitation, and ultimately lost its own future. Cooperative caregiving wasn't a nice cultural feature, it was load-bearing. There's a theory that ties directly into this: the grandmother hypothesis. Human females are unusual among mammals in living for decades after menopause. One leading explanation is that a grandmother who could no longer bear her own children could instead pour that time and energy into keeping her grandchildren alive, foraging for them, watching them, freeing up her daughter or daughter-in-law to do the same. Evolution, in other words, may have selected for grandmothers because grandmothers got results. Feeding. Without a kitchen, there was no pantry, no refrigerator, no formula aisle. For the first several years of life, a child's nutrition depended almost entirely on breast milk, supplemented eventually by whatever the group itself was eating, prepared in the only way available, by hand and often by mouth. Weaning happened gradually and late by modern standards, frequently extending 2 to 4 years. Solid food, when it was introduced, was often pre-chewed by an adult before being passed to the child. Softened, partially broken down, easier for underdeveloped teeth and digestive systems to handle. It's an unglamorous detail, but it solved a real problem. Tough meat and fibrous plants aren't something a 1-year-old can process on their own. Prolonged breastfeeding had a side effect that shaped entire family structures, whether anyone understood the mechanism or not. Extended nursing suppresses ovulation. This naturally spaced births several years apart, without calendars, tracking apps, or deliberate planning. Biology handled birth spacing the way it handled almost everything else in this era, quietly in the background, through a system nobody had to consciously design. risk, discipline, and letting go. Modern parenting often treats risk as something to be eliminated. Ancient parenting treated it as something to be managed because eliminating it entirely wasn't an option. The world itself was risk. Researchers studying present-day hunter-gatherer societies have consistently found strikingly low rates of harsh physical discipline compared to many industrialized cultures. Children were frequently given real independence early, permission to explore, to handle tools, to test limits under loose supervision rather than constant restriction. The underlying logic was practical rather than sentimental. A child who was never allowed to encounter risk in small doses grew into an adult who couldn't handle it in large ones, and in a world with no safety net, that was a liability the whole group would eventually pay for. None of this means ancient childhood was gentle in outcome. It wasn't. Estimates of infant and child mortality in ancient and pre-industrial societies are difficult to pin down precisely, but many researchers place child mortality before adulthood at levels that would be almost unthinkable today, in some estimates closer to 1 in 2 children not surviving to full maturity. Every caregiving decision, every hour of supervision existed inside that shadow. Ancient parents weren't just raising children, they were trying to beat brutal odds day after day with the only tools available: attention, cooperation, and time. What this looks like compared to now. It's tempting to hear all this and conclude that ancient parents were simply tougher than modern ones. That's probably the wrong takeaway. The real difference isn't toughness, it's structure. A modern parent today is frequently expected to do, alone or as a pair, what used to be distributed across a dozen or more people: nursing, feeding, teaching, protecting, entertaining, disciplining, all without the built-in relief of grandmothers next door or a camp full of invested near strangers. It's not that the ancient version of the job was easier, survival odds were far worse. It's that the job itself was never designed to be handled by 1 or 2 people in the first place. Somewhere back down the evolutionary line, when a baby needed to be walked, held, or comforted at 3 in the morning, there was very likely someone else nearby, a grandmother, an aunt, another mother in the group, ready to take over. That redundancy is arguably one of the quiet reasons our species made it this far at all. So the next time a baby monitor buzzes at 3 a.m., or a toddler refuses to eat anything that isn't beige, it might be worth remembering. Somewhere in the deep background of our species, an infant was being carried nearly around the clock, fed mouth to mouth, handed between caregivers who weren't its parents, and kept alive not by one person's willpower, but by an entire group's quiet, constant cooperation. We didn't make it this far because ancient parents were superhuman. We made it this far because none of them were expected to do it alone. Like and subscribe for such new videos, and this is my new original YouTube channel.